that Paul talks about. This is a continuation from the church family, but then it goes specific into people's homes. Because again, Paul's concerned that this isn't just a Sunday experience. This is meant to permeate every aspect of our lives, including our families. So let's read it together aloud. Not together, you haven't got to read it aloud. I'll read it, you can listen, and we'll allow this to teach us as well. So, for the household, Paul says this. Wives, submit to your husbands as is fitting in the Lord. Husbands, love your wives and do not be harsh with them. Children, obey your parents in everything, for this pleases the Lord. Fathers, do not provoke your children lest they become discouraged. Slaves, obey in everything those who are your earthly masters, not by way of eye service as people pleasers, but with sincerity of heart, fearing the Lord. Whatever you do, work heartily as for the Lord and not for men, knowing that from the Lord you will receive the inheritance as your reward. You're serving the Lord Christ, for the wrongdoer will be paid back for the wrong he has done, and there is no favoritism. Masters, treat your slaves justly and fairly, knowing that you also have a master in heaven. So Paul writes to the church, but now here he's writing to the households, made up of family, made up of husbands and wives and children and slaves, or we might prefer the term bond servants, like those who exist as servants within the household to help the functioning of the home. And households in the ancient world weren't like the nuclear household of ours, where we just have a couple of parents and a couple of kids maybe, and maybe a pet. Instead, the household involves this whole community of trade, of coming and going, of different relatives and extended members of that household, including people who work for the household. And in that reading, there is a lot. Okay, as I said, we're trying to bite off a lot. We're not going to necessarily get to everything in it, and so I'll be very happy to talk more about it. But there's something in this text that has offended and been controversial in every culture. There were aspects of what Paul wrote here that offended and was controversial in Roman society, and there's aspects of it that offend and are controversial in our society. What's interesting is that the things that offended Paul's original readers aren't really the bits that offend us. Instead, there are other bits that offend or grate with us, we might say, even if it doesn't offend us. And every society has been concerned with how the family unit, how the household ought to organize itself and behave. That's normal. That's just how you have a functional, healthy civilization. Every society has been concerned with that, so you'd expect God to speak into the household and the family. What I'd like us to do, however, is to read probably the main influence on Paul's original listeners when it comes to thinking about the household. You see, the philosopher Aristotle, he was known, one of the things that he had done and codified was how households were meant to behave. And Roman houses were built around the structures that Aristotle had, or the instructions that Aristotle had given to the family. I'm going to read Aristotle's instructions, which would have been very familiar to Paul's original readers, and then we're going to consider how that is similar and different to what Paul has said. So, listen to what Aristotle says. Aristotle says, of household management, we have seen that there are three parts. One is the rule of masters over slaves, which has been discussed already. Another of a father, and the third of a husband. A husband and father, we saw, rules over wife and children, both free, but the rule differs. The rule over his children being a royal one, over his wife being a constitutional one. For although there may be exceptions in the order of nature, the male is by nature fitter for command than the female, just as the elder and full-grown is superior to the younger and more immature. The relation of the male to the female is also of this kind, but there the inequality is permanent. The rule of a father over his children is royal, for he rules by virtue both of love and the respect due to age, exercising a kind of royal power. This is the word of Aristotle. Thanks be to Aristotle. That was the popular wisdom in Paul's day. And we can immediately see some things that are similar to what Paul's writing to the church and some things that are different. What's similar is that the same members of the household are addressed, aren't they? Husbands and wives, parents and slaves and masters. And what we can also see that's similar is that Aristotle is pointing to the meaning of the world to help make sense of his instructions. He's saying, this is the way of nature. Therefore, because of the way nature is organized, the household needs to look like this. And that makes sense for Aristotle, because Aristotle is a good Greek philosopher. Greek philosopher. His worldview was that the cosmos was this unified whole where things needed to be kept in balance. And so to live as a good member of that household, or to live as a good member of that society, you needed to learn to live in balance and in harmony with nature. And in nature, there's hierarchy, there's power, there's strength, there's dominance over weakness. Aristotle says the man is stronger than the woman. Nature says this. Therefore, he must rule, and that rule is permanent. So Aristotle points to nature and religion to make sense of why he says what he says. The Apostle Paul does the same, but his meaning is very different, because he doesn't point to nature to teach us anything. He points to Christ to teach us how we should behave. So there's similarity and there's difference. Other aspects of the difference is this. Love isn't mentioned as being a motivating factor for Aristotle, but it is for Paul. And secondly, wives and children and slaves aren't even spoken to. He goes above their heads and just speaks to the husbands and the fathers and the masters, whereas Paul speaks to them. There is, in the Christian household, already we can see mutuality as well as meaning. There's meaning for the way they behave, and there's mutuality in the way that they behave towards one another as well. Let's look at some of the mutuality. Why does he speak to slaves? Well, in the Roman society of Paul's day, around 20%, 1 in 5 people were in slavery of some kind. It was the way society and the way that the economy functioned. And so you'd expect him to speak into this. What's strange, though, is that he speaks to masters and slaves. He gives them dignity in the way that he addresses them. What's also of note here is that of the 8 verses addressed to the household, 4 of them are to slaves and masters. Why is that? Why so many on this subject? Well, probably it's a contextual thing, because the individual carrying the letter to Colossae, a man named, my brain's just gone blank, I didn't even plan for this. I think it's Art, no. Oh gosh, that's embarrassing, I can't find it. Epaphras? Not Epaphras, no. Anyway, it doesn't matter. Tychicus, there you go. Tychicus is carrying the letter. And with Tychicus is a man named Onesimus. Onesimus is himself a slave of Philemon, who belongs to the Christian church in Colossae. Paul writes to Philemon. We read that a few months ago. You can see that sermon for more details. But so Onesimus is with him carrying the letter along with Tychicus. And so Paul is writing to a church that has slaves and masters. And among those slaves, some of them have recently become Christians. So he's telling them how to live. That's why he spends so much time talking about slavery. Now, I know in talking about slavery, lots of questions arise. Why does he even address slaves? Why doesn't he just tell them to run away from their masters? Why does he even tell masters how to behave as good masters? Why doesn't he just tell them to release their slaves? A few things on that. Firstly, when we think about slavery, we think our minds are drawn instantly to the transatlantic slave trade, in which millions of men and women were captured from their homes and taken to other places and forced to work in appalling conditions for masters. It was a form of slavery based on capturing people and based on race. In Paul's day, slavery wasn't based on race. Instead, it was based on religion, actually. If you've conquered a people, then your God must be better than their God, so you get to enslave them. So there is difference here. It's also different in as much that it's the way that the economy functioned. And so although Paul does deposit into the household some instructions on Christian living, he does it in a way that over time is going to overturn the institution of slavery, because he treats the slaves with dignity. He tells them that they have meaning, and the way that they behave God sees. He even says to the slaves, the wrongdoer will be paid back for the wrong that he's done. So he reassures them that God will bring judgment to the households and to the masters that treat them poorly. So that's slaves and masters. And if, you see, a master was just to release his slave from slavery into a society that had no provision and no employment like we do, they would have instantly been without accommodation and shelter or provision of any kind. And so instead he addresses the masters to tell them to treat the slaves as brothers and look after them and provide for them and care for them in all respect. That's slaves. We'd also expect, as we saw in Aristotle, that the wives are commanded to submit to their husbands. Paul says, wives, submit to your husbands. But what's different is that Paul also commands the husbands to love their wives and to not be harsh with them. He says, husbands, love your wives. Christian husbands, your husbandly life and activity is spelt like this: honor, serve, lay your life down for your wives. Devote yourselves to them. Elsewhere in Ephesians, we see the reason Paul teaches them that is because he's saying the husband is like Christ, and Christ laid his life down for his wife. So husbands, are you laying your lives down for your wives? Are you serving them? Are you honoring them? Are you being as helpful and as useful as you can in sharing the load of domestic life? Are you behaving in such a way that they would look at you, husband, and say, wow, you love me just like Jesus? If not, husbands, there's a bar, there's more for us to do. He also addresses the wives. Wives, submit to your husbands. And again, there's lots that we could say. I know that a statement like that is controversial in a society like ours. I know people who on their wedding day have taken that out of their wedding vows because they thought, I don't want to say that. Although Paul says it, I don't want to say it. What are we to make of this statement? Well, the first thing we must acknowledge, and we must not be afraid of this, the word submission for the Christian isn't a dirty word. In fact, it's something that all Christians are called to do. To become a Christian is to submit because we say Jesus is Lord. Elsewhere, the church are commanded to submit to one another. Christians are commanded to submit to the rulers and the governors in their society. Church members are commanded to submit to the leaders in the church. Submission is a part of the Christian fabric because when you submit to someone, what you're doing is you're demonstrating trust in that individual and you're wanting to honor them in the way that you relate to them. So that's the first thing that we would note. The second thing that we need to say when we start talking about a passage like this is that wives are not expected to submit in cases of abuse. This is not a blanket statement, wife, stay in an abusive marriage and just submit. We know that because elsewhere in the scriptures, there is clear provision made for situations that arise like that, where both, not just the husband, but the wife are permitted to seek divorce in cases of abuse. So that's another important thing that we say alongside this. But what do we mean then? When Paul says, wives, submit to your husbands, what did he mean? Well, first of all, let's rule out what he didn't mean. Submitting for the wife is not the same thing as blindly obeying the husband. We know this because, look, children are commanded to obey their parents, slaves are commanded to obey their masters, but wives are not commanded to obey their husbands. The relationship is not one of a subject beneath an authoritarian master, you must obey them. That's not in Paul's mind when he writes this. It's also not a case that a wife should submit because that's the law of nature. That's Aristotle. That's not Jesus or Christianity. So what is it then? Paul doesn't appeal to nature. He appeals to something else. A wife's submission to her husband is a choice that she can make, not a given based on nature. We know it's a choice because he has to command it. If you picture a group of people playing football, I do not need to command those footballers to submit to gravity. Submit to gravity. It makes no sense. They have no choice. I could, however, say to those footballers, submit to the referee, because that will make the game better. There'll be some level of, flourishing that happens on this pitch. There's a choice involved. And it's that kind of statement that Paul is making here. He's saying, wives, for flourishing in your marriage, respect, honor, submit to your husband. Offer to him your gift of trust in your marriage. Paul says to the wives that their submission is meant to be in the Lord, meaning that there are clearly cases where they're not expected to submit and respond to their husband's initiatives and ideas. Neither are they supposed to just obey whatever a husband says. No, instead they're to trust him in the Lord. And it's that statement, in the Lord, that's significant for us as we round off this section thinking about the Christian household. There's a new humanity based on becoming part of Team Jesus and therefore living as part of Jesus' people. And there's a new household that's based on relationship to Jesus first and foremost. You see, we repeat the things that we think are important. And in this section on the household, there are 8 verses on the household, and in 7 of those verses, Jesus is mentioned. Because Paul is wanting to make the point here, and I'll come over here for this, that Jesus is meant to be the core guiding axle in our lives, and everything that we do, whether it's being a wife or a husband or a friend or a child or a master, an employer, an employee, everything that we do is connected to the hub of Jesus. So you want to know how to live Christian? It's not just by borrowing ideas from Aristotle and nature. Husbands don't learn about being husbands by going, oh, well, I'm stronger than she is. I'll carry things. That's not how it works. Neither does a wife look at herself and go, oh, well, I guess, I'll just do whatever. I don't know. I was trying to think what would be a comparison, but I thought, risky territory, don't say what comes into your mind. But we don't learn about how to be friends or employers or employees by listening to the latest wisdom of our society. Instead, we learn, how's this connected to Jesus? What does Jesus teach me about this? Jesus laid his life down for his bride, the church. Okay, as a husband, how do I learn? I look at Jesus. Oh, okay. Wives, how do we respond? Well, the church had a groom who laid down his life for her to make her beautiful and pure and spotless in every way. And that's how I am as a Christian. So therefore, I look at Jesus. How do I respond to Jesus? Oh, okay. Now I'll try to behave like that towards my husband with respect and honor and doing what I can to allow him to cherish me. And let's be honest, if you've got a situation where a husband is doing everything he can to honor, to love, to serve his wife, it's no chore for the wife to say, well, I will receive that. I will take that, rather than kicking against that. This is a Christian household and a Christian marriage he's talking about. But in situations, of course, where individuals, as would be common then, as now, where people aren't married to Christian spouses, still the principle remains. Jesus is the core, and everything we do is connected to him. He's the axle. He's the center. Everything flows from him. That's why Paul writes in the bits that we've read, Christ is all in all, he says in verse 11. Then in verse 15, he says, let the peace of Christ reign. And then in verse 16, he says, let the word of Christ dwell. Church, it's all about Jesus. Look at Jesus. Live your life based on Jesus' word, Jesus' teaching. It's Jesus plus nothing. Whoever you are, whether a Christian or not, however you're living, Christian or not, Jesus came for you. He came to teach you, to show you how to live. He loves you. Your life matters to him, which means you don't need to be suspicious of God. You don't need to rebel against him and think, whatever he tells me to do, I'll do the opposite. No, you can learn to trust him and offer your will to him as an act of submission. He's a good husband and a good groom who loves us all dearly. Let me end with this story I was really encouraged by the other day. On Friday, I caught up with a friend that I haven't seen for about 5 years. In fact, I used to see this guy at one time. I used to see him once a week or so. We played squash together for about 10 years. And every time we played squash, we would have discussions about religion and faith. And my friend wasn't a Christian. And he was quite a committed and forceful atheist, in fact. In fact, he enjoyed our squash matches, not just for the squash, but for the after talk, where he could just try to mock me for my belief in God. And I would try to hold my own and answer his questions and explain why I believed what I believed. And I thought I was doing all right. But on one particular occasion, he said to me while we were getting changed, he said, do you know what? You've never said anything that has convinced me in any way about the fact that there's a God. And I was like, I'm doing well then. Things are going well. I lost touch with him and then caught up with him on Friday, 5 years later. we went for a walk. And as we walked and talked, he shared with me about the things that had gone on in his life recently. You know, he was and still is a very strong, capable man. One of those guys that can do almost anything. Read almost anything, can turn his hand to almost anything. Very competent, capable guy. But he said, I've realized in the last 5 years, I need help. I can't save myself. And I've realized that there's more to life than I thought there was. And he said, I'm not an atheist anymore. And I thought, all right, not quite, this is amazing. What do I say now? He said, recently I've been praying and I'm interested in coming to church sometime. Can I come? And I said, no. No, I didn't. Said, of course you can't. Of course you can. Of course you can. And I said, Sean, I've been praying for you for years. This is so wonderful. Such exciting news. The story of his life was one of, I'm the boss, I'm in charge, there is no God. But through life's events, he's come to realize there is more to life than I realized, and I cannot save myself. Maybe I should turn to Christ and receive his word in my life, and how I should run my house, my family, everything. What's the story of your life? Is it always rains on me? I always miss the bus, the story of my life. Well, for the Christian, the story of life is, I can be thankful. It's the story of my life. God's always blessing me. Life's hard, but Christ is with me, story of my life. I'm righteous in Christ. When I stand before God, he loves me, story of my life. What can I say? Because the Father's affection and favor is upon me, story of my life. My sins, there are many. His mercy is more, story of my life. That is the story of the Christian life, that Christ is all in all. Because we're part of the new self. Because everything we do is connected to Jesus. And because it's Jesus plus nothing. Let's pray.